The photograph lay face down on Colonel Morrison's mahogany desk for 3 hours before he found the courage to turn it over. When he finally did, his coffee mug slipped from trembling fingers, shattering against the concrete floor of his Pentagon office. The image showed a dragon tattoo, intricate and fierce, wrapped around a slender forearm. But this wasn't just any tattoo. It was evidence from a classified crash site in the mountains of Afghanistan, photographed by a recovery team who had no idea what they'd stumbled upon. The tattoo belonged to Captain Zara Viper Nakamura, call sign earned not for aggression, but for her uncanny ability to strike with precision when least expected. She'd been missing for 72 hours, her F-16 Fighting Falcon vanishing from radar during what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission over the Hindu Kush. The Pentagon had already begun drafting the standard condolence letters, filing her under presumed KIA in their endless bureaucratic machinery. Morrison remembered the first time he'd seen that tattoo, how the other pilots in the 388th Fighter Wing had snickered behind her back. Dragon Lady, they'd called her, voices dripping with mockery. A 5'4" Japanese-American woman with ink covering her arms wasn't exactly their vision of aerial superiority. They'd expected her to wash out during her first deployment, another diversity quota fulfilled and forgotten. They hadn't known about the sleepless nights she'd spent studying aircraft manuals while her father battled cancer, or the 3 jobs she'd worked to pay for flight school. They hadn't seen her land a damaged trainer on a grass strip with one engine dead and hydraulics failing, saving her instructor's life in the process. All they saw was the tattoo, the quiet demeanor, the way she kept to herself during briefings. But Morrison had seen something else in her flight records: perfect scores in air-to-air combat simulations, surgical precision in bombing runs that left seasoned pilots shaking their heads in disbelief, a strange ability to read weather patterns that had saved entire squadrons from flying into deadly mountain storms. The woman they mocked had become the best pilot he'd ever commanded, though he'd never told her so. Now, staring at the photograph, Morrison felt the weight of every dismissive comment he'd allowed to slide, every time he'd stayed silent when the boys' club closed ranks against her. The recovery team had found something else at the crash site, evidence that Captain Nakamura's disappearance wasn't the result of mechanical failure or pilot error. Someone had been hunting her specifically, and the implications made Morrison's blood run cold. He reached for his secure phone, knowing that this conversation would change everything. The dragon they'd mocked had landed in the middle of something far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. The call came at 3:47 hours, jarring Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from restless sleep in his quarters at Bagram Air Base. The voice on the encrypted line belonged to Morrison, but the words seemed impossible. Captain Nakamura was alive, and her situation had just become a matter of national security. Hayes rubbed sleep from his eyes, trying to process what he was hearing through the static-filled connection. "Sir, with respect, Viper's been missing for 3 days. The search teams found wreckage scattered across 2 valleys. We've already notified next of kin." Hayes kept his voice steady, though his stomach churned at the memory of making that call to Nakamura's younger sister in San Diego. The woman had simply thanked him and hung up, as if she'd been expecting the news all along. Morrison's voice crackled through the encryption. "The wreckage was planted, Hayes. Someone wanted us to stop looking, but our girl is very much alive, and she's stumbled into something that makes this whole theater look like a training exercise." The line went quiet except for the hiss of secure transmission protocols, leaving Hayes to absorb the implications. He'd served with Nakamura for 8 months, watching her navigate the particular brand of military misogyny that followed female pilots like a persistent shadow. The woman could thread an F-16 through a canyon at Mach 1.2 while most pilots were still checking their instruments, but the squadron still treated her like she was auditioning for a role she'd never truly earned. Hayes had been guilty of it himself, though he justified it as maintaining unit cohesion. The truth was more uncomfortable. Nakamura made them all look ordinary. Her flying wasn't just skilled, It was artistic, intuitive in ways that couldn't be taught in any academy. She read the sky like ancient mariners read stars, finding paths through weather that shouldn't exist. Other pilots studied meteorology. Nakamura seemed to commune with it directly. "What kind of something, sir?" Hayes asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The kind that involves foreign intelligence services and weapons systems that officially don't exist. The kind that explains why someone with her specific skill set was targeted." Morrison paused, and Hayes could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I'm sending you everything we have. Prepare your best pilots for immediate deployment, but Hayes, this doesn't leave the room until I give you clearance." The line went dead, leaving Hayes staring at his reflection in the black screen of his secured tablet. Somewhere in those mountains, the woman they'd all underestimated was fighting for her life, carrying secrets that could reshape the entire conflict. He thought about the dragon tattoo they'd all mocked, remembering now that in Japanese mythology, dragons weren't monsters. They were guardians of hidden treasures. Captain Nakamura pressed her back against the limestone cliff face, feeling the cold seep through her flight suit as she listened to the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades echoing through the valley below. 3 helicopters, definitely not coalition forces based on their acoustic signature, too quiet, too smooth for anything in the NATO inventory. She'd been evading them for 2 days now, living on emergency rations and melted snow, watching them search with the methodical precision of professionals who weren't planning to take prisoners. The crash hadn't been random. The missile that had torn through her F-16's left wing had been fired from a position that shouldn't have existed, using technology that made her threat warning systems scream warnings they weren't designed to process. She'd managed to keep the aircraft controllable long enough to reach this remote valley, but the landing had been more controlled crash than graceful touchdown. The fact that she'd walked away with only bruised ribs and a deep gash on her forearm felt like borrowed time. Now, crouched in a cave that smelled of ancient stone and her own fierce sweat, she carefully bandaged the cut that had exposed her dragon tattoo to the recovery team's cameras. The ink had been her grandmother's idea, a traditional Japanese design that was supposed to bring protection to those who traveled dangerous skis. The old woman had paid for it herself, over her parents' objections, saying that Zara would need all the help she could get in a profession that didn't welcome women who looked like her. She'd been right about needing help, though perhaps not in the way she'd intended. The tattoo had become a target for every insecure pilot who needed someone to diminish in order to feel larger. They'd made jokes about authentic Oriental mysticism and asked if the dragon would help her parallel park her fighter jet. She'd endured it all with the same quiet determination that had carried her through flight school, knowing that responding would only give them more ammunition. But the dragon had protected her in ways her grandmother could never have imagined. The intricate design had required multiple sessions with a tattoo artist who'd also been a former Navy SEAL, a man who'd recognized something in her dedication that reminded him of his own struggles to prove himself worthy of elite forces. He taught her survival techniques between tattoo sessions, skills that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with staying alive when the world wanted you dead. Those skills were keeping her breathing now, as she calculated distance to the next ridge line and listened to the helicopter's search pattern. Whatever she'd stumbled into was bigger than a simple shoot-down. Someone wanted her specifically, and they were willing to commit serious resources to the hunt. The secure briefing room at Bagram hummed with tension as Lieutenant Colonel Hayes spread reconnaissance photos across the metal table. 6 pilots sat in uncomfortable silence, studying images that showed more questions than answers. The wreckage they'd been mourning for 3 days was revealed as an elaborate deception, twisted metal positioned with theatrical precision, designed to convince satellite surveillance that Captain Nakamura was dead. "Gentlemen," Hayes began, then caught himself. "And lady," he added with a nod toward Lieutenant Rodriguez, the only other female pilot in the squadron. "What you're about to hear stays in this room until further notice. Captain Nakamura is alive, but her situation has been upgraded to critical national security implications. Major Peterson, Nakamura's former wingman, leaned forward with skeptical eyes. Sir, with respect, we all saw the missile impact. Dragon Lady's good, but she's not magic. The use of her mocking call sign felt different now, laden with guilt rather than casual dismissal. Peterson had been one of the loudest voices questioning her assignment to combat missions, arguing that she was too small to handle the G-forces of high-performance aerial combat. Hayes pulled up a classified satellite image on the room's main display. This photo was taken 4 hours ago. Thermal signature suggests she's moved approximately 12 kilometers from the crash site, evading pursuit by unknown hostile forces. The image showed a faint heat trace winding through mountainous terrain that would challenge even experienced ground troops. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Everyone present had trained for survival scenarios, but actually evading organized pursuit in hostile territory was a different caliber of challenge entirely. The fact that Nakamura had survived the crash and remained free was remarkable. That she was apparently outmaneuvering professional hunters was something approaching miraculous. Captain Williams, who'd once joked that Nakamura's small stature made her look like she was wearing her father's flight suit, studied the satellite tracking data with growing respect. What kind of hostile forces are we talking about, sir? Local Taliban? Foreign operatives? Hayes touched another control, bringing up intercepted radio communications. The room listened to brief transmissions in accented English, discussing search grids and extraction protocols with military efficiency that suggested extensive training and resources. These weren't local militia. They were professionals, possibly government-sponsored, hunting one of America's pilots with enough sophistication to stage false crash sites and coordinate multi-platform searches. Intelligence suggests she may have been specifically targeted, Hayes continued, watching his pilots' faces change as they processed this information. Her particular skill set may have made her valuable to hostile intelligence services, or conversely, made her elimination a priority. The dragon tattoo they'd mocked suddenly seemed less like juvenile decoration, and more like the mark of someone who'd always expected to fight alone against overwhelming odds. Zara pressed her eye to the scope of the emergency beacon locator she'd salvaged from her aircraft, watching the valley below through the gathering dusk. The device wasn't designed for surveillance, but years of making do with inadequate equipment had taught her to improvise. 3 teams of armed men moved through the rocky terrain with mechanical precision, their search pattern revealing training that exceeded anything local insurgents possessed. She'd counted their equipment during daylight hours: night vision goggles, satellite communication systems, weapons that appeared to be modified versions of Russian Special Forces gear. Whoever wanted her dead, or alive, had invested serious money in the operation. The question that haunted her as she rationed her emergency water was why she was worth such expense. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, speaking in the mixture of Japanese and English that had defined Zara's childhood. The dragon protects those who protect others, but sometimes the protection comes with a price. The old woman had survived the internment camps of World War II, had watched her own father volunteer for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to prove his family's loyalty to a country that had imprisoned them. She understood something about fighting for acceptance that never quite came. The tattoo had been expensive, requiring multiple sessions that had cost Zara most of her savings from her part-time job at the base commissary. But her grandmother had insisted, saying that some battles couldn't be won with skill alone. They required the strength that came from carrying your ancestors with you. The other pilots saw only ink and assumed rebellion or attention-seeking. They couldn't see the generations of quiet determination wrapped around her forearm. Now, hidden in a cave that smelled of limestone and her own exhaustion, Zara felt those ancestors watching. The dragon's eyes, positioned so they seemed to be looking toward the sky, reminded her that she wasn't just fighting for her own survival. Somewhere, her sister was probably starring at official condolence letters, trying to explain to her 6-year-old daughter why Aunt Zara wouldn't be coming home for Christmas. The thought crystallized her resolve. She'd spent 3 years enduring jokes about her size, her gender, her ethnicity, proving herself in the air while being dismissed on the ground. If these hunters thought they were chasing some delicate flower who'd fold under pressure, they were about to discover their intelligence was catastrophically flawed. She checked her watch, 0347 hours local time. The search teams would be changing shifts soon, and tired soldiers made mistakes. The dragon hadn't just protected her from missiles and mountain weather. It had taught her patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. The communication array at Bagram Base hummed with activity as technicians worked to establish contact with Captain Nakamura's emergency beacon. Static filled the speakers for long minutes before a faint voice emerged from the electronic noise, hoarse but unmistakably alive. Any station, this is Viper. Authentication code Delta 779er. I'm mobile, pursued by hostile forces, and have intelligence regarding foreign military assets in Sector 77. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes grabbed the microphone with hands that surprised him by trembling slightly. Viper, this is Bagram Control. Authentication confirmed. What's your status? The relief in the room was palpable. Pilots who'd written eulogies in their minds now leaned forward with sudden hope. The response came through layers of encryption and atmospheric interference. Bagram Control, I'm approximately 15 clicks northeast of my original position. Hostile forces are equipped with advanced surveillance gear and appear to be foreign military, not local insurgents. They staged my crash site to stop search efforts. Her voice carried the steady professionalism they'd all trained for, but Hayes could hear exhaustion underneath. Major Peterson, who'd spent the last 3 days replaying every dismissive comment he'd made about her capabilities, stepped closer to the radio. Viper, this is Bulldog. Can you identify the hostile forces? Numbers, equipment, anything that might help us mount a rescue operation. A pause filled with static then. Bulldog, estimate 30 to 40 personnel, rotating in teams. Equipment appears to be modified Russian Special Forces gear, but communication protocols suggest these aren't Russians. Someone's invested serious resources in this operation. The clinical precision of her assessment reminded everyone why she'd graduated top of her class from Air Force Intelligence School before transitioning to pilot training. Captain Williams, remembering his jokes about her needing a booster seat in the cockpit, felt shame settle in his stomach like cold lead. The woman they'd treated as an affirmative action checkbox was providing intelligence briefings while evading professional killers in terrain that would challenge elite survival instructors. Her detailed observations about equipment and tactics revealed a mind that processed threats with analytical precision, even under extreme stress. Viper, we're coordinating extraction options now, Hayes responded. Can you maintain position for 48 hours while we develop assets? The laugh that came through the radio held no humor. Bagram Control, I've been maintaining position for 3 days. I think I can manage 2 more. The subtle irony reminded everyone that she'd been fighting for her life while they'd been planning memorial services. As the radio fell silent, the men in the room exchanged glances that carried years of unexamined assumptions. The dragon they'd mocked was proving to be exactly what her grandmother had promised, a protector whose strength revealed itself only when truly tested. Zara moved through the pre-dawn darkness with footsteps that barely disturbed the loose scree, each placement calculated to avoid the small avalanches that could give away her position. The hunting teams had established a perimeter that would have trapped most people, but they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed she thought like a pilot, not like someone who'd grown up rock climbing in the Sierra Nevada mountains with a grandfather who taught her to read stone like other children read books. Her emergency rations were nearly exhausted, but the mountain provided alternatives for those who knew where to look. alpine plants that could sustain life, snow that could be melted for water without revealing her position through smoke, caves that offered concealment without becoming traps. Skills her family had taught her during weekend camping trips, never imagining they'd one day keep their daughter alive in a war zone. The dragon tattoo caught moonlight as she checked her watch, 0543 hours. The hunters would be expecting dawn movement, anticipating that exhaustion and cold would drive her to make desperate choices. They'd positioned themselves to intercept someone running toward coalition territory, not someone patient enough to use the terrain itself as a weapon. She'd identified their command post 4 hours earlier, a cluster of advanced communication equipment hidden in a valley that offered excellent sight lines but poor escape routes. Professional soldiers, but not mountaineers. They understood tactics but not the specific challenges of alpine warfare, especially against someone who'd been rock climbing since she was 8 years old. The slope above their position was unstable, held together by nothing more than morning frost and gravity's patience. A precisely placed disturbance could bring down enough stone to disrupt their operation without causing fatal casualties. Soldiers scattered and confused, their communication equipment buried, their organized search turned to chaos. It would create the window she needed to reach coalition territory before they could reestablish their perimeter. Her grandmother had told stories about her grandfather's service in the Pacific Theater, how Japanese-American soldiers had used the enemy's expectations against them. Foreign armies expected Americans to fight like Americans, with overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. They didn't expect someone who'd learned patience from ancient mountain stone and precision from generations of ancestors who'd survived by being underestimated. The dragon on her arm seemed to pulse with warmth as she began her ascent toward the unstable slope. Every pilot in her squadron could fly through the most sophisticated aerial defenses ever devised, but none of them could disappear into mountain terrain like smoke. The skills they'd mocked were about to become her salvation. The avalanche began as a whisper of shifting stone, then grew into a geological roar that echoed through valleys for miles around. Zara pressed herself against the cliff face 200 meters above the cascade, watching tons of limestone and granite pour down the mountainside like a gray waterfall. The sound was magnificent and terrible, the mountain reshaping itself according to laws older than human warfare. Below, the foreign military team's command post vanished under layers of rock and debris. She could hear shouting in multiple languages, Russian, definitely, but also something that might have been Mandarin or Korean. The voices carried panic and confusion rather than pain, suggesting her calculation had been correct, enough destruction to scatter the operation without wholesale slaughter. Their sophisticated communication equipment was buried under tons of stone that would take heavy machinery days to clear. Without coordination between hunting teams, their carefully planned perimeter would collapse into isolated groups wandering through terrain they didn't understand. The technological advantage that had made them so dangerous was now working against them. Zara waited 30 minutes before beginning her descent, using routes she'd identified during 3 days of careful observation. The dawn light revealed the scope of the geological rearrangement. An entire section of the valley floor had been reshaped, creating new gullies and ridges that would confuse anyone using previous maps or satellite imagery. She moved through the devastation like a ghost, occasionally hearing distant voices as scattered teams tried to reestablish contact with their buried command structure. Their previous confidence had been replaced by the uncertainty that came from operating in truly hostile terrain without adequate preparation. Mountains demanded respect that couldn't be purchased with advanced weaponry. The emergency beacon in her survival kit remained silent. She wouldn't risk communication until she'd reached coalition territory. But for the first time in 3 days, she felt something approaching hope. The hunters had revealed themselves to be competent professionals operating sophisticated equipment, but they'd underestimated both the terrain and their quarry. Her grandmother's dragon was proving to be everything the old woman had promised, a protector that struck when enemies expected weakness, using patience and ancient wisdom against modern arrogance. The tattoo had marked her as different in ways the military community couldn't accept, but those differences were now the only thing standing between her and capture. 23 kilometers to coalition territory. The distance felt manageable for the first time since the missile had torn through her aircraft. The mountain had provided its own form of air support. The rescue mission briefing at Bagram Base crackled with urgency as intelligence officers spread updated satellite imagery across briefing tables. The avalanche had been detected by seismic monitoring stations across 3 countries, but its timing and location suggested something more than natural geological activity. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes studied the thermal imaging data with growing amazement. Captain Nakamura appeared to be moving steadily toward coalition territory, while her pursuers remained scattered and disorganized. "Sir," Captain Williams ventured, his voice carrying newfound respect, "how the hell did she trigger an avalanche with that precision? The debris field took out their command post but left escape routes open for personnel evacuation." The engineering implications were staggering. Calculating the exact point of geological failure required understanding rock formations that most pilots couldn't even identify. Major Peterson examined topographical maps with the intensity of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about mountain warfare. "She's been planning this for days, hasn't she? Watching their positions, studying the terrain, waiting for the perfect moment." The tactical sophistication impressed him more than any aerial maneuver he'd witnessed. Hayes nodded, remembering intelligence reports about Nakamura's background that had seemed irrelevant during pilot evaluations. Her family's mountaineering experience, her geology minor from the Air Force Academy, her summer job as a wilderness guide before military service, details that had been dismissed as recreational interests, were now revealed as survival skills that exceeded anything taught in military training. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission. "Bagram Control, this is Viper. I'm 10 clicks from Checkpoint Alpha, moving through terrain that should be clear of hostile forces. Request you authenticate my approach before I cross into your weapon's range." Her voice sounded stronger than it had 12 hours earlier, carrying confidence rather than desperation. "Viper, this is Bagram Control. Authentication Delta 779er confirmed. We're tracking your approach and have cleared all firing solutions in your sector." Hayes paused, then added something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Outstanding work out there, Captain. You've exceeded every expectation." The response came after a moment of silence. "Copy that, Bagram Control. The Dragon sends its regards." The reference to her mocked tattoo carried no bitterness, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd proven every doubt wrong through actions rather than words. In the briefing room, 6 pilots sat in contemplative silence, each processing their own complicity in nearly losing the best pilot any of them had ever served with. The woman they dismissed as a diversity quota had just conducted a one-person military operation that would be studied in tactical schools for decades. Zara emerged from the mountains as the sun reached its zenith, her flight suit torn and stained but her bearing still carrying the unconscious precision that marked professional military bearing. The coalition checkpoint guards, soldiers who'd seen everything Afghanistan could produce, stopped their conversation and stared as she approached their perimeter. Something about her movement suggested capabilities that extended far beyond standard pilot training. The first medic to examine her found injuries that told the story of 3 days fighting for survival: dehydration, exhaustion, lacerations from rock climbing without proper equipment, and the kind of muscle fatigue that came from sustained adrenaline over extended periods. But her vital signs remained stable, her cognitive function sharp, and her debriefing responses demonstrated the analytical precision that had kept her alive. "Captain Nakamura, the intelligence officer began, his recorder spinning quietly between them. Can you describe the foreign military assets you encountered? His question was routine, but her answer would reshape the entire regional threat assessment. Zara pulled up her sleeve, revealing the dragon tattoo that had become legend over the past 72 hours. They knew about this, she said simply. Specifically, one of their team leaders referenced it during radio communication, called me the woman with the dragon mark. This wasn't a random intercept. They were hunting me personally. The implication sent cold realization through the room. Foreign intelligence services had identified individual American pilots, studied their backgrounds deeply enough to recognize identifying marks, and deployed significant resources to eliminate specific personnel. The level of intelligence penetration suggested threats that extended far beyond regional conflicts. Why you specifically? The intelligence officer pressed, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nakamura's flight records were exceptional even by Air Force standards, but more importantly, her analytical capabilities and survival skills had just been demonstrated under the most extreme conditions imaginable. She touched the dragon's head with fingers that still trembled slightly from exhaustion. My grandmother always said this would bring protection, but not the kind most people understand. Dragons don't protect through strength, they protect through wisdom, patience, and the ability to strike when enemies least expect it. Her voice carried quiet certainty that settled over the room like mountain silence. The debriefing would continue for hours, but everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The pilot they'd nearly written off as killed in action had survived through skills that couldn't be taught in any academy, using capabilities that came from cultural knowledge and family tradition rather than military doctrine. The dragon tattoo had indeed brought protection, just not in any way the Pentagon's training manuals could have anticipated. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as Colonel Morrison finished reading Captain Nakamura's after-action report aloud. General Patricia Chen, the Air Force's highest-ranking female officer, studied the classified documents with the intensity that had carried her through 3 decades of military service in an organization that had never quite decided whether women belonged in combat roles. "Gentlemen," General Chen began, her voice carrying the authority that came from surviving every argument about gender integration the military had ever produced, "we need to discuss the elephant in this room. One of our pilots was specifically targeted by foreign intelligence services, survived 3 days of professional pursuit, and conducted successful counter-operations using skills that aren't taught in any of our programs." The men around the table, mostly colonels and generals who'd spent careers discussing theoretical threats, shifted uncomfortably as they processed the implications. Captain Nakamura's survival wasn't just remarkable, it was embarrassing. Their own intelligence had declared her dead, while she was outmaneuvering foreign special forces using techniques that came from civilian, mountaineering experience and family tradition. Morrison cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the tactical implications are significant. If hostile forces are specifically targeting our most capable pilots, we need to reassess protection protocols for all high-value personnel." His words carried weight, but everyone present understood the subtext. They'd nearly lost someone irreplaceable because they'd failed to recognize her value. General Chen pulled up personnel files on the room's main display. Captain Nakamura's records show consistent excellence that was apparently overshadowed by cultural biases and gender discrimination. Her survival skills came from sources we never bothered to evaluate because they didn't fit our institutional assumptions about what makes an effective military officer. The dragon tattoo appeared on screen, a photograph taken during her initial medical examination, showing the intricate artwork that had become symbolic of capabilities the military establishment had failed to recognize. The design was traditional Japanese, representing protection through wisdom rather than aggression, strength that revealed itself through patience rather than domination. I want every pilot in her squadron here tomorrow morning, General Chen continued. Not for disciplinary action, but for education. They're going to learn why their colleagues survived when our best intelligence assessment said survival was impossible. Her tone suggested this would be a learning experience that extended far beyond tactical training. The room remained quiet as officers processed the uncomfortable truth that their institutional culture had nearly cost them someone whose capabilities exceeded anything their selection processes were designed to identify. The woman they dismissed as a checkbox for diversity requirements had just demonstrated that she was probably the most capable pilot any of them would ever command. The award ceremony took place in a hangar at Bagram Base, with Captain Nakamura standing at attention before an assembly that included every pilot from the 388th Fighter Wing. Her dress blues carried ribbons that told the story of exceptional service, but the dragon tattoo visible at her collar seemed to command more attention than any official decoration. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes held the Distinguished Flying Cross, but his prepared remarks felt inadequate as he looked at the woman who'd survived 3 days of pursuit by foreign special forces while they'd been planning her memorial service. "Captain Nakamura," he began, his voice carrying across the hangar with unusual gravity, "your actions during the period of 1518 October represent the finest traditions of military aviation and survival." The pilots assembled behind him, men who'd spent months making jokes about her call sign and questioning her presence in combat roles, stood in formation with expressions that mixed shame, respect, and something approaching awe. Major Peterson, who'd been her loudest critic, found himself studying her bearing with new understanding of what quiet professionalism actually looked like. "The dragon tattoo that became symbolic of this operation," Hayes continued, surprising everyone by directly addressing the elephant that had haunted squadron dynamics for months, represents traditions of protection and wisdom that proved more valuable than any of our standard training protocols. Captain Nakamura survived through skills that came from cultural knowledge and family heritage that we failed to recognize or appreciate. Zara accepted the medal with the same composed dignity she'd maintained throughout months of subtle discrimination and outright mockery. When invited to speak, she stepped to the microphone with bearing that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment her entire military career. "My grandmother told me that dragons protect those who protect others," she began, her voice steady and clear. "She also said that protection sometimes requires patience, waiting for the right moment to demonstrate strength that others can't see." Her eyes moved across the assembled pilots, not with accusation, but with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed their approval. "I didn't survive those 3 days to prove anything to anyone in this room. I survived because people who loved me had given me tools I didn't even know I was carrying." She touched the dragon tattoo briefly. "But if my experience helps others understand that strength comes in forms that don't always fit our expectations, then maybe something good can come from those mountains." The hangar erupted in applause that carried genuine respect rather than obligatory ceremony. For the first time since her assignment to the squadron, Zara felt like she was standing among colleagues rather than skeptics. 6 months later, Captain Nakamura walked through the corridors of the Air Force Academy as a guest lecturer, her flight suit bearing patches that told stories of operations that remained classified but whose general outlines had become legend throughout military aviation communities. Cadets stopped conversations to watch her pass, recognizing someone whose reputation had transcended normal military hierarchies. The classroom filled with future pilots who'd grown up hearing about the Dragon Lady incident through unofficial channels, the woman who'd survived professional hunters using mountain climbing skills and family traditions that weren't taught in any military curriculum. Her story had become part of Air Force folklore, though the classified details remained locked away in Pentagon files. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing a class that was 30% female, a significant increase from her own academy days, Today we're going to discuss survival tactics that aren't in your textbooks. Specifically, we're going to talk about how cultural background and family knowledge can become military assets in ways that institutional training often overlooks. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the dragon tattoo that had become synonymous with capabilities that extended beyond conventional military thinking. This ink has been photographed by intelligence agencies from 3 different countries, she said with dry humor that earned laughter from students who understood they were receiving instruction from someone genuinely legendary. But the protection it provided didn't come from mystical properties or cultural superstition. It came from representing knowledge systems that my family had preserved and transmitted across generations. Knowledge about reading terrain, understanding weather patterns, maintaining psychological resilience under extreme stress, and thinking strategically when conventional options are exhausted. A cadet raised her hand. Ma'am, how did your family background prepare you for military operations that none of them had experienced? The question showed genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Zara smiled, remembering her grandmother's voice during long camping trips in the Sierra Nevada mountains. My ancestors survived internment camps, racial discrimination, and systematic exclusion from opportunities they'd earned through merit. They learned that survival often requires using skills that others don't recognize as valuable, maintaining dignity when others question your worth, and proving yourself through actions rather than arguments. The classroom fell silent as students processed the connection between historical resilience and contemporary military capability. The dragon tattoo represented more than individual strength. It symbolized the transmission of survival knowledge across generations of people who'd been consistently underestimated by institutions that should have known better. The classified briefing took place in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, where General Chen presented Captain Nakamura's case study to senior intelligence officials from multiple agencies. The implications of foreign targeting of specific American pilots had led to a comprehensive review of personnel security protocols and threat assessment procedures. The Nakamura incident revealed systematic failures in how we evaluate both threats and capabilities, General Chen explained, her presentation displaying satellite imagery from the rescue operation. Foreign intelligence services identified and targeted one of our most capable pilots, while our own assessment systems had categorized her as standard personnel with unremarkable qualifications. The dragon tattoo appeared on screen again, this time accompanied by analysis from cultural anthropologists and military psychologists who'd been brought in to understand how family traditions had translated into survival capabilities that exceeded anything taught in military schools. The research findings were challenging long-held assumptions about what constituted relevant military experience. Captain Nakamura's survival skills came from sources that our personnel evaluation systems don't recognize, General Chen continued. Rock climbing with her grandfather, wilderness camping with extended family, cultural knowledge about patience and strategic thinking that had been transmitted across generations of people who'd survived systematic discrimination. An intelligence official leaned forward. General, are you suggesting we need to start recruiting based on family background and cultural traditions rather than standardized test scores and flight school performance? His question carried skepticism, but also genuine curiosity about operational implications. I'm suggesting we need to recognize that diversity isn't just about fairness, it's about operational capability. General Chen responded with the directness that had characterized her entire career. Captain Nakamura survived because she brought knowledge systems that our enemies didn't anticipate and our own military didn't understand. She represents capabilities that can't be replicated through training alone. The room digested this uncomfortable truth. Their institutional biases had nearly cost them someone whose capabilities were irreplaceable precisely because they came from sources the military establishment had never learned to recognize or value. The dragon tattoo had protected its bearer not through superstition, but through representing knowledge that transcended conventional military thinking. The meeting concluded with orders to develop new assessment protocols that could identify unconventional capabilities before enemies did. Captain Nakamura's case had become a template for recognizing value that didn't fit traditional categories.